Thanks very much for that, Todd. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Todd. I'm going to go through and talk about sort of what's been my experiences over my time when I was in DPI, and also covering sort of some of the things that I've really found very important when we're running into this type of season that we're in now, and being with cows late pregnancy and also cows that are calving down now. Look, what I've found is don't sort of underestimate the value of your past experience. Often past experiences are really good sources of information. They help you work out what strategies have worked, what didn't, what things you're able to actually fine-tune. It was probably one of the best bits of advice when I kicked off as a livestock officer in DPI that my couple of mentors that I had said to me, get out, have a look, get in the paddock, see what's worked, see what doesn't, see how your advice has gone. And you really do build on your knowledge. With farmers, it's very important too that you look at what's worked for you, what hasn't worked. It helps you assess your risks, what's actually coming. You can take into account your own seasonal conditions. More importantly, you can look at plans to help make those decisions and step yourself through these fairly difficult times. Drought strategies, always the same. We've got the option of adjustment. That's now a possibility in some areas, in probably in the next month, with some rain falling in some parts and not in others, but always comes with risk. My biggest piece of advice with adjustment is don't just set and forget. Actually go out and have a look. And also very, very important that you look at using resources in those areas, like some of the district veterinarians or local veterinarians or even local agents, to find out what issues might be in some of these areas. So keep an eye out for the adjustment option, but make sure you do it in an informed way. You find out what's there. Nothing worse than sending animals away on adjustment and all of a sudden finding out that some of these pastures that looked half reasonable aren't performing very well, or more importantly, that there's a disease or an issue in a certain particular place. This has come up in 2002, 3, 6, 7, multiple times throughout my career, but it is sort of something that people need to think about. In the last few months, I've been dealing with a bit of the sell-all stock, and I've had a few people make that decision. It's fairly confronting. But it's also an opportunity for some of these people to look at their business, look at what you're actually doing. Is it where you want to be? Look at your markets, and also a chance to change direction and management. Finally, we've got the feeding option, and that's what I'll really cover in detail today. And we'll look at that supplementary early drought. Well, in all honesty, we're past that now with the majority of the state that I've seen in the last few months and some of the calls I've been getting. So we're really looking at full hand feeding, meeting all those animals' nutritional needs, and be that in either a confinement, feedlot, or in a paddock situation, and trying to sort of meet their requirements and try to manage those animals as best we can. Some really important tips that I've picked up over the time is that if you start looking at that feeding and sort of what you're going to do and how you're going to manage it, one of the first things that I look for is water. Water will bring you undone with your feeding programs. If you might have everything set up right, but poor water can really cause lots of problems and lots of issues. So if you're looking at sort of how to manage it, bring them in, confining them up, or even picking certain paddocks, really is important that you do a water audit, find out exactly how much water you've got, what's the quality, are there any potential issues. I know in the past that I've run into problems with poor water, poor performance, and it is one of the key things I look at first and foremost. The other thing that I would say is, while we're talking about cows and managing cows and calves, don't forget about the bulls. It's always an issue that we run into. People forget about bulls. They just sit to the side. Yep, I'm not going to need you to October. You're right, you'll get through, and all of a sudden we get to October, November, when the bulls need to go out, and I get the question, how do I manage him? What do I do? He's not in good enough nick. It's really important that you don't forget about the bulls in this scenario, and if for the people giving advice, to ask that question. The other thing, very important to plan. Have that plan, but look at it in 3-month blocks. Are your cows going to be calving? Can you look at weaning? Is there joining coming into that time? So that 3-month block is very, very important, because, you know, are those cows in that last 3 months? It really is important that you have a plan. The other thing is weaning, and weaning early. And it's one of those ones that I'm getting questions about with autumn herds. How early can we wean? It depends, and we'll cover that later on when we look at sort of what are some of the key trigger points where I really say that weaning is your only option here. The other thing is cull with a purpose. It used to be my advice when I was early on in the department, and it was the written rule: you got rid of age groups. You got rid of 10s, 9s, 8s and 7s. You then looked at the bottom end, you know, that first calvers, second calvers and things like that. I've really moved away from that. I know that the modelling work that we did through Stock Plan, plus also work that I did with Lloyd Davies, who was an economist with the department, really showed that it's important that you look at actually taking out the non-performers or the tail of the mob. So I think now's the time, if you're giving the advice or you're looking at your own herd, to think about what animals should I actually look at culling. A cow herd that's calving for 9, 12 weeks in some cases, really those later calvers are the ones that are going to cause you problems. They're going to have the smaller calves. So if you do early wean, really is important that, you know, you try to minimise the issues. And by getting rid of those late calvers is probably the best thing that you can actually do. Mouth, go through structure, any problem animals in the herd, now's the time to see them gone. But really, that picture of that cow there's a classic. Cull with a purpose. That's a little Angus cow. She's only about 450 kilos, and that calf next to her is a 6-month-old calf and over 300. You know, look after those cows that look after you, and that's so cull with that purpose. The other thing that's really, really important is don't just go into a paddock when you're looking at your feeding. Think about, okay, which are some of my key animals that I need to have a look at and monitor those animals. And even if you write it down in a little diary when you're looking at them, look at those selected animals. I know when I'm feeding out of my own place, I've got a cow that comes up. She's G281, and she's always a cow at the back of the vehicle when I'm feeding out the hay. So I monitor her. I monitor a couple of other cows that one's got a white udder. Pick out selected animals so that you can actually monitor them and say, okay, what are they actually doing? Am I seeing grooming behaviour? You know, what sort of behaviour am I seeing with their cows? You're seeing that grooming behaviour, you're really getting an indication of what those animals are actually feeling like. Are they feeling good, bad or indifferent? And look at the behaviour of the mob, what's actually happening. The other thing, and it sounds very simple, but it's something that I find is very, very important, particularly when we're getting all these mixtures of fodders that we're getting in. Look at the poo. The higher the poo, the poorer the quality. You know, it really is that simple. So if we're buying in some of these really poor quality feeds that we're now starting to see come around, the poo's indicating that I need to actually look at fine-tuning, changing some of my management to probably better meet those needs. I know at a place I was at recently, went out, didn't see the grooming behaviour on some of the cows, and also, you know, they had poo like soccer balls, you know, so looking at what other things we can add into that feed to actually improve performance. One of the big ones, and when I give advice, and it was probably very important for me when I kicked off in the department, that I had a stage in 02-03 where we actually got sat on a telephone inquiry line. We had to give away a day a week, a day a fortnight, where we sat on that. And I got very used to being at Mudgee and covering out into that central west zone. And everyone had grain gear, everyone had silos. All of a sudden, I started getting calls from other areas where people didn't have some of that equipment. So whenever I'm giving my advice or asking people to think about what they've got, options they've got, really one of the biggest questions I ask them, what equipment do you actually have? Do you have a tractor with a bucket? Do you have feeders? Do you have silos, augers and the like? And that's really going to have an influence on what advice you can give and how those people can manage those animals. Also, what's the setup on the farm? Is there an old feedlot or is there an old confinement feeding area? Also, what we find is location. And when I give my advice, I look at the location, think about where are you, what location are you in, what resources are here. We know that there is feed coming out of the south at the moment, but in the past, cottonseed was a real northern influence. We knew we had it, we knew it was there. People in the south didn't know too much about it. So, you know, but it wasn't an option. All of a sudden there's white cottonseed being grown down the Riverina. All of a sudden people are aware of it, and that's obviously an option. So look at the location where they are. Also, what feed resources are actually on your place? And this is a question that is important. I know on the land in the last few weeks, there's people talking about getting silage out of the ground they've had down for years and the like. But also, I was on a property the other day where they were talking about pulling grain out of grain pits that they've had down for quite a number of years. So that's going to have an implication on what options they've got. Sometimes, and I know this is a fun one, but talking to a producer the other day who was pulling some lupins out of a pit, the option was to actually sell some of those lupins because of the price that he was able to receive. And all of a sudden that frees up some other money to look at buying some other cheaper feeds. One of the big ones is what conditions are your actual cows in? Where are they sitting? Are they in, you know, good fat score 3? Are they in fat score 2? What condition are your actual cows in? And it's important that you talk that through and look objectively at your cows, or you ask the important questions. Cow performance. It's one of these ones I'm seeing lots of different feeds out there, but really sort of the basics that I look at, the ME requirement for a cow is really that 7. Once you start to fall below 7 with a dry cow, that's only just going to, you know, she's going to start to lose a bit of weight. Things aren't going to be working overly well. So crude protein, if it's down below 6, start to think about how we can change things a little bit. Once they get into that late pregnancy sort of stage, obviously the minimum energy and protein that they require changes. And then once we're getting into lactation, it lifts up again. You know, so all important things when we're looking at what feeds that are there and what is and isn't available. This is one that, you know, it's been around there for a long time, a few little changes to it, but really it's still important as the basics of what we look at. You know, the adult dry cows, grain only. I know it is a bit of an issue with some people getting past that block that you can't just feed grain, you've got to feed some hay. But it is a very, very useful tool, and during 02-03, grain only to dry cows and cows in late pregnancy was a very useful tool. I went through some of my PowerPoints and some of my overhead slides, telling you how old some of those presentations are. And really, the grain only option is a very valuable option because you don't have to feed much to get them across the line. Yes, you need to be careful. Yes, you need to manage how you do it. And yes, it does become an issue when we get some of these screen feed issues that we're running into where animals are going off feed and chasing green pick. But it is one of those things that you can look at. All my slides, when I go back to the early 2000s, involve talking about Australian Wheat Board contact numbers for them. This is how you contact them. Hay only, I know I'm seeing a lot of hay coming around and getting fed out. It would be nice if all this hay was 8.5 ME, but unfortunately we're seeing a lot of that hay not even getting to that point. I know with some of the samples that we've been doing around about the place that we're getting a lot of these hays that are actually below that. They're at 7, or in some cases actually below. So it is really an important one to take stock of that hay. Looking at the grain hay option, obviously a bit better grain, a little less hay, and then sort of silage and the like, all sort of in the mix. But remember, if you're buying silage, use the tools that are available, the likes of the feed cost calculator, the Drought Feed app, and work out how much you're actually paying. So in the last few months, we've had some really big changes in what people have been able to source. All of a sudden, Cottonseed's come online. We've got a lot of people being able to get hold of Cottonseed. It started off cheap. It was running at roughly around about $250 delivered into the central west, central tablelands area and into northern New South Wales. We're now seeing that jump, and it's up around that $400 a tonne delivered at the moment. So I'm going to cover Cottonseed a little bit further in a little while, but it is a very, very valuable feed resource at the moment. And it is one, and talking to a producer on the drive over this morning, he said, it's so easy for me. All I need is a bucket, the back of my ute, and a shovel. And he's able to make that work, and he's currently feeding about 400 cows. Bit of extra effort for him, but it is working. The other thing that we're seeing a lot about of late, and I know I saw something come through on Feed Central that, you know, they've got a mix now with almond hulls and the like, is the almond hulls and use of almond hulls. Normally something we see in feedlot mixes and the like, reasonable energy. I know they quote 10.5 energy and protein levels at 5, 5.5. The tests of the almond hulls that I've taken this year have shown us that it's varying between 9.5 ME and roughly around about 10.5 ME. So just a bit below some of the quotes. Also, protein levels have been slightly behind the 5.5. Grape mark has been something that we've seen a lot of. There's been a lot of press in the last few weeks. Really, we've seen that run out just in the last couple of weeks from down south out of the Riverina. Still a lot of it sitting around. There are a few little things to be aware of with grape mark. Obviously, there's issues with you know, a lot of the energy actually being tied up in the seed. The seed not being available goes passes straight through, so a lot of the goodness not being there. So I tend to just refer to grape mark as a roughage and a roughage only. Also, the tannins tend to bind up a bit of the protein, so we can get some poorer performance than what we expect. One to be aware of, and with grape mark, is I normally have just discounted the seed, but what we're finding with some of this grape mark that's been down for a couple of years, it's composting a bit, and it's actually caused some of the seeds to break down. So all of a sudden we've ended up with an overload with oil for some animals. So it is an important one to think about if you're looking at putting grape mark, or if someone's got a heap of grape mark and putting it in the mix of animals. One that I'm seeing now and being asked a lot about is rice straw. I saw a lot of rice straw when I was over in Japan, got used to it pretty well, very harsh, and it's one that really is purely roughage and low quality, and you need a lot of other things to go with it to make it useful. Sorghum hays, we've got a lot of sorghum hays and sorghum stubbles around. One thing I would say is some of the energies of these are testing up quite well, but the protein levels of some of these feeds, the sorghum hays and stubbles, have been a lot lower than what I'd normally expect. I had a test the other day with a group of producers that came in at only 3% protein. So need to bear that in mind. It might have sufficient energy, but not enough protein. The other one that we're seeing, and it's coming out of Queensland, are some of these C4 hays. How are we going to actually manage those hays? The likes of any of your tropical grasses, they're going to be lower digestibility. If the management hasn't been into that hay practical experience has taught us that the proteins are going to be very low and the energies are going to be very low, particularly when they've been cut very late and as bulk as what we're seeing at the moment. So be aware, if you are looking at some of these tropical sort of pasture hays, that you really can only feed a relatively small proportion, and you're going to require a fair bit of other goodies to lift the overall quality to meet the animal's minimum requirements. Molasses and molasses products, I love it if you're set up for it. I've had quite a few people in the last month, 6 weeks, have been asking me about, you know, buying molasses, getting set up for molasses and the like. Molasses and fortified molasses products, so molasses with cottonseed meal, urea and a phosphorus, have been a mainstay of the northern industry and right through the hunter. With a bit of roughage, you're able to make some fairly good gains. But unfortunately now, you know, is not the time to say to people, yep, go out, get into molasses. You know, if we're dealing with big, large mobs of cattle, then you're dealing with large quantities and you really need to be set up to handle that. It's all right if you're only dealing with 30 or 60 animals, but you're still, even with 30 animals, you're needing 2 drums of molasses twice a week. Protein meals, I know there's been issues with the canola meal and also cottonseed meal, but I have been told that the cottonseed meal will be coming back online a bit in the next few weeks. The other one that we're really starting to see is copra meal. I know there was a delivery of copra meal just came in, and that can be used to stimulate the appetite, get the animals actually eating more, make better use, but more importantly, we can put it in with other mixes and make animals better utilise some of these poorer roughages and get some better performance. Cottonseed would be half or more of the inquiries that I'm currently getting. I've based a lot of my experience with cottonseed on my past use, past practical experiences with it. I've known in the past that I've been able to get away with feeding a lot more than what's been advised, the 30% of the diet at times. It is an extremely useful tool to get animals, lift them up, get things working, and be able to get animals that are in a bad situation out. I find it extremely useful to introduce grain. In one example recently, I had a producer that had some cows that were having a few little issues with, well, he was having some issues with, and I was telling him, put 20% of grain in, kick it off there, and then gradually bump your grain up, drop your cottonseed off. It's a very useful one to actually get it up and get it going. Some things of note. 2018 feed test results for cottonseed are very different to the cottonseed tests that when I go through back through my feed tests that I've done over my career, we're seeing normally we expect the oils to be about 20, 22, a lot of the time % oil. All the tests that I've got this year have been between 12 to 17% oil. So, which means we're able to actually feed a bit more. Also of interest is some of the delinted cottonseed that I've sent away. We've seen some very, very high quality tests. One sample that I sent away came back at over 14 megajoules of energy and came back at over 29% protein. So in saying that, it had below 17% oil concentration. So very, very useful little feed for feeding, making use of that feed. I was out on the place that's actually using that delinted cottonseed, and the change in the cows since he introduced it with what was reasonable quality cereal hay has been huge. So really is one that it's worthwhile playing it by ear, having a look. I know a lot of our stuff says, you know, maximum 30%. Realistically, practically now, I'm comfortable in giving advice to say that you can actually feed more of that. What you also find with cottonseed is that animals will tend to self-limit on it. So it is a useful one when we get some of these really poor conditions running through. So currently in the central tablelands, we're starting to run into some of these issues with cows falling over. You know, they've been fed cereal hay. They haven't not really in that bad a nick. So it's one of those ones that I'm saying, get some cottonseed, get them onto it and get them going. Very, very poor quality hay mixed with cottonseed. Yes, you can do it, but I tend not to give the advice with cows in that scenario where I say you can get away with feeding twice a week. If you're feeding very poor quality hay, the likes of sorghum hays or some of these C4 tropical grass hays, I've been saying to people, you really need to do feeding 3 times a week, little and often. The other little trick that I definitely would suggest, and this came up with a producer recently who had some fair bit of sorghum hay, was that it was the option to actually cut back on that sorghum hay. He was put as much as they could eat, and unfortunately that was really causing problems, blocking them up. He's giving them, yep, some were eating up and others weren't. So I really say little and often. And thing to remember about this, I know people tend to be of the opinion that, you know, they'll fill them up, get them nice and full. They're not at an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's important to manage your cows with a calorie-controlled diet, that you're actually meeting their needs and giving them what they need. Some really important tips, and some of this has been brought back in the last couple of weeks. Waste needs to be accounted in the amount you're actually feeding. So if you're working on those quantities that we've talked about and that were there before, where we're saying a cow needs 5 or 6 kgs of this and things like that, it's really important that you think about the waste. If you're feeding in different scenarios and we're feeding this calorie-controlled diet, it's important that you actually take waste into the account. So past experience, if we're dealing with grain just dumped on the ground in, say, 20 kilo dumps, we'd normally see about 6 to 8% waste for cattle. If we're seeing grain trail fed out to cattle, that actually goes up. More fouling, more animals treading over it and the like. And the waste can be up as high as 15 to 20%. So really important that if you're looking at working out your feeding amounts or you're giving advice on how much to feed, that you think about how much actual waste is in that feed and how much they're actually requiring. Underfeeding is a big problem that I've seen, and I see it all the time. We tend to find that people tend to tick along, everything's going well, and you get away with it in semi-serious droughts. But now we're in a proper serious long-term drought where animals have been underfed for a long time. It really is becoming a big issue. One of the things that I would really stress is actually work out how much hay you're actually feeding out. I know there's people buying hay by the bale and they're saying it weighs this, it weighs that. Blarkus, it's not. Some of these hays are being overestimated by 150 odd kilos on what my practical experience tells me they should weigh. The other thing, and I had a producer tell me the other day that his bucket of his tractor would be 700 kilos of cottonseed in his dreams. Actually do the work, weigh it, work out actually how much is in there, how much you're feeding. It is important, and now is the time. The other big trick that I have with managing these cows, I really am not a fan of feeding on the ground. I'd much prefer to feed in troughs, concentrates or feeders, and they don't have to be much. There was a photo there before of a tractor tyre cut out, and it works really, really, really well. Important that you do have enough trough space. That 60 centimetres is a minimum for cows. You go under that, you'll have bullying, dominance behaviour, and animals not getting as much. I'm seeing advice about feeders, people saying, oh, you can fit this many animals about. The basics don't change. You know, you've only a certain number of animals you can get around some of these feeders. The other thing, and this is something I did a lot in 2002-3, is have a look at your cows, and it's important to draft that tail and manage them separately. Pull them off. If you're getting it starting to develop a bit of a tail, take the bottom 15-20% off and actually start to manage them. Give them a little bit more TLC, a little bit more effort, and they'll reward you. I'm just going to go through some cows, and look, the condition of the cows is one of those really important things that triggers a lot of my management. I'm looking at a cow here, and we're seeing she's a good cow, fat score 3. If all your cows are looking like that, or the cows you're giving advice are looking like that, home and hosed, everything's excellent. We're seeing a cow here now starting to fall into a low fat score 3, just starting to see a little bit more fat come off her. Still happy, all my cows look like that, it'll all be excellent. We're now looking at a cow that's into that high fat score 2, and this is a European cow, obviously. But you can start to see that she started to denude herself of fat, but still things happy, ticking along. We're now sort of dropping into that, from that 5 mils into that fat score, bottom end of a fat score 2, that 4 mils of fat. We're starting to say, okay, how are we managing these cows, looking at meeting the actual needs? Then the next cow is sort of about the bottom end of where I'd sort of be saying, okay, our management, what do we need to look at? And trying to manage that cow correctly is very important once we're looking at this low 2. After they've sort of starting to get past that, that is really my trigger point for when I sort of start to look at my management of my cows and how I'm going to manage them. This is a cow that's in fat score 1. You can see she's denude. We're starting to see a bit of spinous process, starting to see a little bit of muscle utilisation. So this is sort of my trigger. What do I look at? How do I manage them? Okay, I really need to be thinking about weaning a calf off this type of cow, because it's near on impossible to feed her enough to pick up any weight while they've got a calf on. So the best way to help her is by weaning the calf. Once we get into cows that are sort of starting to get down into this sort of condition, this cow's looking substantially better than what she should do because she's turned away from us. We really are at the action stations, and early weaning is the biggest option and biggest way that we can manipulate the outlook of this cow and change how she's going to come through the drought. Once we get cows that have been down into this stage, it really is not very much options with her with what we can actually do. And this cow had a calf on her on a property I was doing some work on, and the first bit of advice was wean all calves when we've got a mob of cows that are all similar to this one and this one. This is sort of a warning. This is a cow as part of some welfare work that I was doing in the department. Low body condition cows that in that welfare category, and you can really see this cow. She's got a bit of moisture on her, making her look nice and shiny, but she wasn't too dissimilar to that black cow in that previous photo. This is that carcass of that cow. You can really see that she's denuded all the fat off her. You're really seeing the loin there. It's not doing it justice. It was only about 2.5, 3 centimetres high, that loin muscle. Inch in other language. So you're really seeing those cows, once they're getting down into that bottom end, they've really mobilised a lot of their reserves. So it really is important to look at that weaning and weaning those calves off. Early weaning's a big tool. It's something we can use in these, and it doesn't matter. However I've done the sums, it's always cheaper to split the cow and the calf than trying to feed a calf through a cow. Younger than 6 weeks, if you've got cows that are like those last few photos, really that is your option, unless you've got bucket loads of money and bucket loads of feed, which most people aren't in the scenario of having. Younger than 6 weeks, you've got the option of selling them or wean and feed them. Very, very rarely have I found it successful. You're looking at having to have milk. There's a whole heap of issues with health, and talk to a vet, because you're going to need to talk to them if you're thinking about weaning animals younger than 6 weeks. Older than 6 weeks, 90 kilos is where I really sort of say, okay, we're on the run here at the moment. There's things like DDG pellets, which I've used in the past, or the powder, to successfully wean calves at that 80 to 90 kilos. But you still need a good quality roughage, and you're going to need, to manage them and manage them well. Older than 12 weeks, 120 kilos, then really it's very, very easy. Once they're sort of up over that 120 kilos, we can manage them and we can get away with a bit bigger mobs, and the quality doesn't quite need to be as good as those ones under the 120 kilos. Really important things, if you're advising or you're thinking about early weaning, and this is the year to be really thinking about it with what's going on, like with like. Don't try to put a 90 kilo calf in with a 150 kilo calf. It just won't work. The 150 kilo calf will outcompete, outboss him, and this is a perfect example. This little photo here of a bloke who had some early wean, just a rough setup, and he managed those calves brilliantly right through. But the key important thing is very uniform mob, like with like. The lighter they are, the smaller the mob. So you won't ever hear me when I'm talking about those small calves under 120 talking about mobs of 150 or 200. That's just too big, too difficult. It's too hard to pick up the shy feeders or animals that are starting to get sick. Shy feeders, identify them, and the sick ones, and separate them out. Best thing I like about shy feeders, they're the ones you sell. They give you that sell option. The other big trick I've picked up over the years, and I know I see a lot of them, is these overhead hay racks. Just think about it. Animals are putting their head in underneath that, all the dust and stuff's falling on their eyes. I've seen some respiratory issues. I've been talking to some vets. It's just not a good thing. Get the hay down. Don't have them eating up into the hay. It really is an issue. Also, look at health. How are you going to manage them? Look at your marking. Are you going to do it before or after? Better if before. Give them a couple of weeks before you look at that early weaning and the like. The other thing that I would like to just briefly cover is the options of something like creep feeding. Something that you can do with some of these calves. It does take a bit of the pressure off the cows, but vitally, by looking at something like creep feeding, and it can be very simple, like this little mix down here on the left-hand side, where it's just a oats and barley mix, that, the quality of that feed can be reasonable, lifts them up, gets those calves bigger, heavier sooner. More importantly, by having those calves exposed to creep feeding, all of a sudden they become far easier to early wean. We tend to find if people have used creep feeding prior to early weaning, we get less shy feeders. We make use of limited resources. So a producer recently that I was dealing with had a oats crop, and he set up a creep gate. So the calves were going in and actually eating that crop. Put all the cows and calves in there together, it wouldn't have lasted a week, whereas now he's making use of that for longer. And the other big thing is by doing that creep feeding, you've got a more saleable, marketable option, and we're looking at things like light feel and the like. So very, very useful tool and something to keep in the back of your mind, planning and looking ahead how you're going to manage what's been a fairly ordinary situation. Look, finally, I know this is a bit of a different one. The season will change and we'll learn from our experiences. My past experiences, and I'll put my hand up, this was me who bogged the backhoe. Yes, it is mine. Interesting thing here, that is only 5 months variation in those photos in the same paddock. I was cleaning the bottom photo, cleaning the last dam out on my place. The top one was June 2016. The rain will come, it will change, but very important that we learn from our experiences, and that will help us moving forward. I'd like to thank DPI for having me and talking today. Todd.
Thanks, Brett. There's a couple of comments here, mate.
Yep.
Lisa Martin has noted that grape mark, either the mark or the raisins, are toxic for dogs, in case the dogs might have access to that, I guess. C4 that Brett had referred to, we're referring to tropical pasture and tropical pasture hay there, as against C3, which would be your temperate species.
Yep.
Lisa has also commented that she thinks it's important to add lime with the cottonseed, and I guess that's probably even more important, Brett, if you're shandying grain in with it.
Yes, look, definitely adding lime is vitally important. We're finding that a lot of these things are minerally out of whack. And it's my stock standard advice, 1.5%, or to make up a dry lick with lime and salt.
Excellent. Someone has also asked a question or made a comment. Brett, there was canola hay and canola silage made last year due to frosts in the Riverina. Producers were feeding this, I guess, as the entire ration. Level of glucosinolates can vary between seasons and paddocks. Are you cautious about feeding too high a percentage of canola hay and silage for any reason?
Practical experience with it over the years, and last year wasn't the only year that some poor buggers got hit with frosts. I would say I've seen limited problems with it, would be my experience, and there's been tons upon tons upon tons fed. And talking to some of the vets that I've spoken to, and sort of the amount of farmers that have been feeding it, I can honestly say that any problems have been very, very small.
Okay, good. Have you ever run into a situation where the canola might be quite advanced and there might be some seed, and that obviously can have a fair bit of oil in with it, so that the canola silage on top of a white cottonseed supplement can lead to an oil problem?
I've not seen the quite advanced silage with canola. I have seen the quite advanced in hay, and practical experience tells us that a lot of the seed just passes through, gets unprocessed. It would be something I'd be more mindful of with younger animals than older animals. And past experience with an issue that I've had with grape mark and cottonseed, where it's been a tried and true recipe that you get away with a 20% grape mark as a roughage component as a proportion with white cottonseed, has shown that cows handle it, ewes handled it, young lambs did not handle the grape mark that broken, the seed had basically broken down, so all of a sudden the oil. So it is something that I would be aware of, but I think practical experience tells us it's not going to be a huge issue with older cows.
Yeah, no, great. Steve Love says that this has been an excellent presentation, Brett, and it's great to have someone of your experience talking to both producers and extension providers in this webinar. So thanks, Steve. That's very, very kind of you. You no doubt meant to thank me for getting you on as well. Is there any other questions or comments? I don't see anything here. Look, so if there is, maybe I'll make one other comment, Brad, and that there's been some emails being passed around about producers that have been feeding a white cottonseed and some, either some pretty roughage, I guess you'd call it. And you made the point there that it's really important to keep an eye on the energy, and so in those situations to add the grain. And you mentioned shandying the grain in with the white cottonseed as against trying to provide it in a small amount in a trough. Just anything to add there?
Oh, look, am a bit guilty at times saying, oh, you can get away with this. Cottonseed will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Some of these feeds that we're testing up at the moment are making cardboard look absolutely wonderful. If you're trying to take feed products that are below 40% digestible and feeding it as a large proportion, a limited amount of cottonseed, it really is not going to be enough overall energy or protein to do the job. I would say also with dealing with those really poor quality hays that it is vitally important you don't just do the twice a week feeding. You're going to have to. Practical experience tells me you need to do the 3 time a week feeding with that, and not let them ad-lib at it, because they will just fill up on it. But look, I've in the past used cottonseed to introduce grain and get grain levels up pretty quickly. And I think it's something that's been a bit forgotten, and it doesn't take much. At a place I was at recently, he just had he was shoveling the cottonseed, and he just had the buckets of grain there, and he was just mixing it in. Didn't look good, but worked a treat. Doesn't have to be really complicated.
Look, that's great. Brilliant practical advice. Look, so that's all we have in terms of questions, as far as I can see, questions and comments. So look, thanks so much, Brett, for, again, you're really experienced and taking the time out. I know you're extremely busy to pass on the value of all that experience. If there are any more questions, Brett has kindly allowed us to put his mobile number and an email address there, and we'll endeavour to share anything with all the people that have attended today. I know lots of other people haven't been able to attend because everyone's flat out at the moment, but the recording will be there. Lastly, I'd just like to say that next month's webinar is going to be presented by Matthias Suarez, and he's going to just talk a little bit about supergenomics. You might have heard about this project that the DPI is embarking on. Matthias is going to talk a little bit about the objectives of the project and how we see it rolling out. So that we haven't got a date yet in August, so I'll let you know. But look, I guess just winding up, thanks again, Brett Littler. Thank you, also Tracy Lamb, and that's all for today's webinar. See you soon.